is David Satterfield. He was born in Baltimore. He's a native, went to the University of Maryland in Georgetown. So he has very much a local connection. His mother, Mrs. Kemp, I think is somewhere with us tonight, right here in the first row. We're always delighted when this happens. We've had this on several occasions where parents of our guests are Baltimoreans. But Ambassador Satterfield has been in the Foreign Service since 1980, a quarter of a century of serious experience, which for a lot of you seems like a long time. For others of us, 25 years is less. But he's had wonderful assignments. His early postings were in the Middle East, to Jeddah, that critical old port city in Saudi Arabia, to Tunis, to Beirut, and to Damascus. And he had the important assignments within the Bureau of Near Eastern and Southeast Asian Affairs. He served as the director of the National Security Council's group on the Near East for a number of years. He was assigned to INR at State Intelligence and Research. He was our ambassador to Lebanon. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs before he became Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs recently. And he also, during that period of time, was in charge of the State Department team on the Arab-Israeli conflict. So he's had wonderful assignments within state. He's had a good career. He's had a large number of important State Department awards. So we look forward with great anticipation to his remarks. Our good acquaintance, Ambassador Satterfield. Great pleasure. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to come up here and to address this audience. I especially appreciate your indulgence towards me this evening. The delay in my arrival can be jointly blamed on the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Aviation Administration. As the pilot of my plane back from New York this morning didn't seem to have the code necessary to land at National Airport, and thus we had an interesting few hours on the ground in a remote part of the tarmac at Dulles. But nevertheless, very, very happy to be here. And I know all of you, or many of you, will be watching the debates tonight. Those debates, which will be focused this evening on foreign policy issues, will touch upon, I think, many of the same issues which we will be addressing tonight. I hope to have a good opportunity to take questions and answers from you. Happy to go as long as you are interested in continuing. The general title for my remarks this evening, as usual, is going to be The Middle East Challenges and Opportunities for the United States. Well, the challenges part of that title is abundantly clear to all of you in this audience and to most Americans, and they're quite daunting and they're quite grim. Today's news alone is indicative of the challenges we face. 38 Palestinians dead in Gaza. 40 Iraqis dead in a series of car bomb explosions in Baghdad and its vicinity. And the toll goes on. Regimes that appear resistant to democratization, resistant to the tide of history, as it has been written over the past 200, 300 years with respect to the evolution of civil society, the development of human rights, the sense of a social contract between governed and governing bodies. All of these challenges appear quite daunting. But there are opportunities here as well. And beneath the very real, very difficult situation which not just the United States, the world, the international community, the inhabitants of the Middle East themselves face, do lie signs of real progress, signs from which some genuine hope can be taken. I'd like to discuss with you this evening some of the principal areas where those challenges and opportunities exist. I could not, of course, begin with any topic other than Iraq. The toll in Iraq for Iraqis themselves, for Americans, for those of our coalition partners who are engaged in this effort of completing the process of not just liberating Iraqis from the tyranny of Saddam Hussein and a 3 decades old Ba'athist regime, but perhaps as significantly, putting in its place an Iraqi government which is responsive to the will of the Iraqi people, which is democratic in substance as well as form, which is stable, which can bring prosperity to the Iraqi people. That's the challenge. There is a political process underway in Iraq today, often lost in the daily news bulletins of American deaths, coalition deaths, Iraqi deaths, of acts of terror, of acts of barbarity, beheadings, hostage-taking. It's a political process which is engaging all Iraqis, Shia, Kurds, Sunnis, city dwellers, tribes. It's a process which we have encouraged, we speaking broadly, the United States, the coalition, the international community, but a process which is at its core and in its direction Iraqi, not externally dictated. And this is a process of discussion, debate, exchange, dialogue as Iraqis talk amongst themselves, within communities and between communities, to try to see how best to move forward on the path to national elections by the end of January 2005, elections which will put in place an Iraqi National Assembly, which in turn will have the responsibility of drafting and approving an Iraqi constitution, and by the end of 2005, the emergence of a fully Iraqi, fully authentic national government and set of governing institutions. We're fascinated by the dialogue taking place within Iraq, despite everything, despite the threats posed by religious extremists, the jihadists or Salafists, despite the threats and challenges posed by the remnants of the Ba'athi regime, elements of that older Saddam dictatorship who seek to block this transformation. Iraqis are talking. Iraqis are coming to work. Iraqis are cooperating and participating in their own government. And they're dealing with other countries in the region, with their neighbors, and around the world as a sovereign entity. This is extremely important. It must not be lost sight of. But the challenges confronting this very positive process of political development and evolution and dialogue with Iraq are quite evident. Security, above all, must be established. Iraqis must be able to leave their homes, to go to work, to participate in the affairs of their country without fear. They cannot do that today. That is the greatest challenge facing Iraq. Not creating a political process, the process is there. Not instilling a sense of nationhood, that sense of nationhood is there as well. But it is dealing with the threats posed by secular, by religious extremists. What's the vision of those who are creating these terrible actions? What are they aiming at? Are they aiming at us? No. We are, of course, victims of their attacks, as are those from the international community cooperating with us. But their real target, and those who have borne the brunt of these vicious, murderous attacks, are Iraqis themselves. The goal of the terrorists, because there's really no other word to apply to them, whatever their label may be, religious, secular, in between, their goal is to terrorize Iraqis from moving forward, to terrorize Iraqis not from cooperating or participating with us, with the coalition, with the international community, but with their own government. It is to bring about a situation of chaos and fear that will enable either a return or restoration of some form of Ba'athist dictatorship, or, as dark, a newly established religious dictatorship, made all the more grim by the cruel, cruel tactics being used to intimidate the Iraqi people. This must not be allowed to succeed. We, the international community, the people of the Middle East, Iraq's neighbors, are resolved to stay the course, to help the people of Iraq move forward in the direction that they have chosen, and to say to those who would oppose that course, you shall not prevail, you shall not succeed. Now, the price of this is very high. It's high today, it will remain high in the time to come. It would be very naive to assume otherwise. But we do believe Iraq can emerge as something very different in the Middle East, as a democratic, free market state where its own people decide their own destiny. Now, that's all too rare a phenomenon in the Middle East today. And the cost of success or failure, positive or negative, for the whole Middle East is too great to treat lightly. If Iraq can move forward as this democratic entity successfully, it will be a model for other states in the Middle East. If it fails, then that in turn can be a model for the Middle East as well. And it will be a very dark, very bleak model indeed. It will give courage to those who elsewhere in the region would seek to impose the same kind of vision that those now confronting the Iraqis in Iraq are posing. What are we doing, we the United States, to help? First and foremost is our commitment of forces in Iraq. Forces who are engaged side by side with their coalition partners, side by side with Iraqis themselves, in helping to move Iraq forward, in helping to restore stability. As you know from the news, this is a challenge that cannot always be addressed in a political fashion. Where military force is required, where there is no other alternative, where diplomacy and negotiation fails, the multinational force in Iraq is fully prepared to use military force as necessary for as long as necessary in order to secure control for the government of Iraq. And I want to underscore that last point. It is not military operations for their own sake. It's military operations for the purpose of transitioning to Iraqi control as rapidly as possible. We have had successes. Iraq has had successes. The rebellion of Muqtada al-Sadr, the firebrand Shia cleric in Najaf and Kufa, has been suppressed. The people of those cities have welcomed the restoration of Iraqi government control. But in Sunni-dominated cities around Baghdad and in Baghdad itself, the challenge continues. In Fallujah, in Baquba, in Samarra, in the Thawra district or Sadr city district of Baghdad, there the challenge remains tonight. It's a very significant challenge, but it's one that has to be addressed. We are moving forward to prepare the Iraqis themselves to assume security control in their own country. The multinational force will not be there indefinitely. When Iraq tells us it is time to go, we will leave, and we have made this very clear, publicly and privately. But there must be an Iraqi security force to maintain stability in their own country. And so under the leadership of Lieutenant General Dave Petraeus, one of our ablest commanders in the Middle East, training of Iraqi police, security, intervention forces is moving ahead. This is not a process which is going to come to conclusion overnight. There is not going to be an Iraqi as opposed to American or coalition face on security tomorrow or next week or next month, but it is coming. And in the confrontation with Muqtada al-Sadr, Iraqi forces proved themselves to be courageous, to be capable. But they need more forces. That will require training, and the training is going to take time to progress to completion. But we are determined to move, and Iraq is determined to move with us. It's interesting to note that the single greatest group targeted by the terrorists are recruits for the Iraqi armed forces and for the Iraqi police services. They're targeted as they line up outside recruiting stations. They're targeted in their training facilities. Reason for this is very clear. This is the face of the new Iraq. This is a face which can't be labeled occupation, can't be labeled foreign intervention. If Iraqis are able to take control of their own security, then the argument posed by the terrorists that this is somehow a struggle against the United States, against the West, against occupation, vanishes. So they want to stop it. But despite this, the recruits keep coming. Iraqis are not cowed. They are not afraid to continue. And on the civilian side, Iraqi governors, Iraqi officials who have been targeted in many cases repeatedly for assassination, continue to come to work, continue to do their jobs, and this should be a source of encouragement as well. Iraq has neighbors, and Iraq's neighbors have an obligation to help, not hurt, the process of consolidation of Iraqi authority and Iraqi governance in that country. To Iran and Syria, we and our partners in the international community have addressed a very blunt message. It is in your interests to see Iraq succeed. You would be very unwise indeed if you were to conclude that harmful intervention in Iraqi affairs, confrontation with the Iraqi government or the multinational force supporting the Iraqi government would somehow gain you, would somehow be to your advantage. that would be a grave mistake. We see Iranian intervention in Iraqi affairs, Iranian manipulation of the Iraqi political process to Iranian ends, and this needs to stop. From Syria, we have had a long dialogue, fruitless until very recently, aimed at stopping the flow of secular and religious extremists across the border from Syria into Iraq and breaking up the cells within Syria that facilitate this transit. We don't hold the Syrian government culpable of actively supporting this movement, but we do hold them absolutely responsible as a sovereign state for controlling their borders and controlling what goes on within their territory. Now, we've recently had a series of very senior-level meetings in Damascus with Bashar al-Assad, the president, and with his senior intelligence and military officials. A U.S. general staff-level military team just left Syria yesterday. They had positive and constructive discussions. Positive and constructive discussions. The tone was good. But frankly, discussions and tone and rhetoric and statements don't really matter anymore when it comes to Syria, when it comes to Iran. The one thing that matters is action on the ground. We will hold Syria, we will hold Iran accountable by what it does or does not do now, in the days and weeks ahead, to take steps in the direction that we have laid out so clearly. And there are consequences for each that can be positive or negative from the steps they take. Both states can have a very positive role to play in the region and in the world, and with the United States if their behaviors change. Both states also face further deterioration in their relationship with us, and in the case of Syria, the near certainty of additional sanctions, should they not take this opportunity to amend their behavior and to act constructively towards Iraq, towards its people, towards its government. Beyond Iraq, we have, as always it seems, the ongoing saga of the Middle East peace process, of the Israel-Palestinian crisis. 40 Palestinian dead today. Yesterday, 2 Israeli children killed in their home by a missile attack launched from the Gaza Strip. 1,000 Israelis dead, 3 times that many Palestinians killed over the course of the so-called intifada or uprising. As Secretary Powell said yesterday, speaking to Al Jazeera, the Arabic language satellite channel, the time has come for the intifada, or whatever this uprising may be called, to come to an end. It has done no good for the Palestinian people. It has brutally, brutally devastated their economy, the fabric of their society, and their prospects of achieving what President Bush outlined in 2002 as his goal, our goal, for the Middle East. 2 states, Israel and Palestine, a sovereign, viable, democratic Palestine, living side by side in peace and security. Enough. It has to end. There is beneath the violence, however, there is beneath this terrible stalemate that has marked the Israel-Palestinian situation over these now 4 years, an opportunity. The opportunity is presented in the form of a unilateral initiative undertaken by the government of Israel to withdraw completely from the Gaza Strip. A unilateral initiative, but an initiative whose actual execution needs to be conducted in a fashion which draws in support. Support from Israel and the Palestinians' neighbors, support from the international community, support from the United States. We have been deeply engaged with Palestinians, Israelis, and their supporters and friends around the world alike to try to see how we can best help this initiative move forward and succeed. And there are really 2 parts to this. There's the actual withdrawal from Gaza, a process which Prime Minister Sharon has indicated will take place at some point in late spring, summer, early fall of next year. That's one step. But the other and probably more important step is what comes after. Is Gaza to be a political, social, and economic quagmire, a swamp for extremists, religious and secular? Or can it be a model on the road towards the 2-state vision outlined by the president of progress that can then be made in the West Bank? We hope very much it's the latter. We see, the United States sees, and our partners in what is known as the Quartet, Russia, the European Union, and the United Nations, we collectively see a genuine opportunity here, an opportunity that can advance both Israeli and Palestinian interests and the broader regional and international interest in this crisis moving to a resolution and the violence and the terror stopping. If Gaza withdrawal is conducted in the context of the roadmap to Middle East peace endorsed by the President and the two-state vision laid out by the President and reaffirmed by the international community, by the Security Council since, that kind of withdrawal from Gaza can be enormously positive. It can help break this stalemate. But it's going to need a lot of help. It's going to need a lot of work. Security must be established for withdrawal to succeed and for Gaza to be something positive, not negative, after withdrawal is finished. We have welcomed the courageous and sustained role played by the government of Egypt in this process of helping to restore security in Gaza. Egypt has stepped forward, despite criticism of its role from within the Arab world and elsewhere, stepped forward to discuss directly with Israel in very constructive, very productive talks how Egyptian forces can better patrol and control their border with Gaza to help prevent arms smuggling, how Egyptian trainers and advisors could be present as withdrawal actually moves forward in Gaza itself, both to help stabilize the situation and to help Palestinians restructure and retrain their very dispersed and ineffective security forces. And Egypt has also been engaged in a political dialogue that extends from Chairman Arafat through Prime Minister Abu Allah to the Palestinian factions engaged in violence themselves. And the Egyptian message has been very clear. To Arafat, it is, you must move. You must empower a prime minister and civil government. You must allow the empowered restructuring of security forces under clean hands. And to the Palestinian radical factions, the message is there must be a comprehensive and lasting end to violence and terror. There must be an end to attacks on all Israelis, everywhere, once and for all. Now, this is a process that we have supported strongly. No one can play quite this role that Egypt is undertaking as well as they can. They have our support. They have Israel's strong support in this undertaking. We welcome President Mubarak's courage in sustaining this dialogue in the face of what are often very bleak images indeed, and propaganda from throughout the Arab world that accuses those who are trying to work to secure a better future for Palestinians of being collaborators with Israel, with the United States, or some darker conspiratorial scheme. We have also welcomed the strong support provided by the government of Jordan under King Abdullah. Support not only for the Middle East peace process, not only for a successful disengagement in Gaza, but also vital support for our undertakings in Iraq. No Arab state has been as forthcoming, as forward, or as courageous as Jordan in helping us to help the Iraqi people secure a better future for themselves. In the Gulf, we have strong allies in Kuwait, in the Emirates, in Bahrain. We have partners who have worked with us both on the peace process and on Iraq as well. But these partnerships, these alliances, have another dimension as well, a newer dimension, something that wasn't part of U.S. policy or diplomacy or discussion for many, many decades, and something that's really very important for the future of the Middle East and for establishing true stability in that troubled region. As I said in my opening, the appearance of the Middle East is all too often one of rigid, monolithic, glacial regimes that don't change, that resist the pressures of time and modernity and history. That's not quite true. There is change afoot in the Middle East. There is a civil society movement which over the course of the last decade, but particularly the last few years, has been speaking out more and more boldly, not just overseas or in exile, but at home, speaking of the need for more open political systems, for greater participation in society, in economics, and in politics by all the people of the Middle East. And by all the people, I include the 51% of the Middle East that are women, and who in so many countries have been denied that opportunity for equal opportunity and equal participation. This civil society movement must be encouraged and must be sustained. the movement toward more liberal economic systems away from the rigid dirigiste systems of the past, that also needs to be sustained and supported. And so, this administration, with our partners in the G8, has articulated a vision of support, sustainment, and encouragement for what we refer to as the broader Middle East and North Africa. It's not a vision or an agenda or a set of requirements which we are purporting to dictate to the people of the Middle East. Not at all. That would fail. It would be rejected out of hand. Instead, we want to recognize, nurture, sustain but not smother with our embrace, something that all too often we do, those native movements towards change, because they're real, and they have to be encouraged, they have to be continued. We've spoken out more directly than we ever have in the past as a government about the need for change in governance in the Middle East. We have many friends in the Middle East who have supported the United States in critical policy issues, and that's important to recognize. We do have vital economic, security, and political interests in that region, and they can't be ignored. But we also can't ignore the fact that true stability in that region will only come through a process of greater liberalization, democratization, and participation in society by all of its people. There's a particularly striking, if not shocking, statistic that surprises most audiences when one looks at the demographics of the Middle East today. 65% of the population of the Middle East is under age 20. And that percentage will grow. This demographic bulge has enormous, enormous dangers if societies do not liberalize their economic, social, and political structures. It is from this demographic bulge that the recruits for secular or religious extremism come now and will come in the future. These individuals, men and women, need to see that they have a stake in their country, their society, their economy, their political system. A radical change is going to be required. The alternative for the Middle East, and thus for the world and for us, is not a pleasant one. We believe it is essential that the U.S., with its partners in the industrialized world, do move forward, do commit resources, and the resources will have to be significant, to helping move the Middle East forward as so many other regions of the world have moved forward over the course of the last 3 decades. The price of not doing so is far, far greater for us today and for tomorrow. So we have in the Middle East 3 fundamental challenges: Iraq, the process of trying to end the violence between Israelis and Palestinians and move back on track a political negotiation that can yield a lasting resolution to that enduring conflict, and the broad process that transcends individual countries of encouraging and supporting movements at home for a greater liberalization, greater democratization, transformation, and reform in the Middle East. Those who fight these goals, the terrorists, will remain. They will have to be confronted. But it's important to remember that they are, at the end of the day, a minority, not the majority. The majority of the population of the Middle East wants a very different future for their children. They want the same things we want. They want what former President Clinton once, I think, very eloquently referred to as the quiet miracle of a normal life. Nothing more than that. Our goal, as the United States, our goal as a member of the international community, is to help make that quiet miracle take place. Thank you very much. Happy to take your questions on these or any other topics.
Thank you. You haven't painted a very, it was somewhat depressing, but it could be even worse, I suppose. The President has said that Iran will not be permitted to have nuclear weapons. You in your presentation mentioned that Syria and Iran would be held accountable for negative actions in Iraq. Has the administration done any thinking in terms of the military and budgetary consequences of prolonged confrontation or even military intervention in terms of Syria and Iran?
Let me address first the Iranian nuclear program, because it is a very significant issue for us, for the international community. When you look at a nuclear weapons development program such as Iran, you're really looking at two different timelines. One is a notional timeline to actual acquisition of nuclear weapons, but there's another more immediate timeline. When does that state acquire the ability, without relying upon external assistance or technology, to develop that program on its own? Both are of great concern to us. And the latter deadline, the point at which Iran becomes wholly self-sufficient in development of a nuclear weapon, is not that far off. The actual acquisition is probably much more prolonged. We are trying to stop this problem before it becomes the kind of crisis that will need to be addressed in perhaps more dramatic and more costly fashion. So what are we doing? What we have been doing is mobilizing the international community, mobilizing based around the fact of Iran's own now revealed deception to the International Atomic Energy Agency of its nuclear enrichment, uranium enrichment program, to mobilize the international community, particularly the European Union, to spell out to Iran the consequences that can befall it, economic, diplomatic, political consequences at first, if it does not change its behavior on these issues. It is to focus the IAEA on its responsibilities as the entity charged with enforcement of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran is a signatory to. Not to skip the issue, not to duck the issue, to be fair, to call deception deception, to use that charged word consequences in its own reporting. And we will continue to work in this direction. There will be very important meetings of the International Atomic Energy Board of Governors coming up in the next 60 days. There is the possibility of reference to the Security Council, something that we think is very important from the IAEA's findings. Now, these are all diplomatic tools, but they are tools that can carry a political and an economic edge to them, which we would hope would convince those in governance in Iran to change this very, very threatening behavior. We have made clear we are not prepared to see Iran acquire a nuclear weapons capability. We're not threatening. We are simply stating a fact whose implications should be clear to all in Iran. We hope it doesn't come to the point of confrontation. That's not the right way to resolve this. It's not the ideal way. We hope that other tools along the course of the next months can work, but this is a very significant challenge. But I would add, in discussion of Iran and its nuclear program, a success story for the United States, and that's Libya. Libya, over the course of the last 10 months, has moved from a state which had a nuclear weapons program, biological weapons and chemical weapons programs, an intimidating missile system, to a state which has now disarmed itself completely of its weapons of mass destruction, in many cases physically transported by the United States and our partners out of the country, has given us information on the history of those programs, which has allowed us and our allies to wrap up one of the most threatening nuclear proliferation networks in the world, the AQ-Khan network run out of Pakistan. This was a success for American and British diplomacy, scored without a single shot being threatened or fired, without a single U.S. citizen put in harm's way. Why did Libya do this? Because we were able, over the course of years, to convince the Libyans of the pros and cons of taking this, in our view, very rational step. And I believe it was because Colonel Gaddafi saw what happened in early April in Baghdad and drew the conclusion that continuing with these costly programs was not in his government's, or his people's interests. Libya serves as an extremely positive model of how a state can transform itself from an international pariah under full UN sanctions to a state which now has today the possibility of normal economic relations, commercial and financial relations with the world, including with the United States. This is a huge step forward. Now, we still have issues with Libya on questions of terror, past involvement. And those questions will have to be resolved to our satisfaction and the satisfaction of other countries before we fully normalize relations at the ambassadorial level. But we very much hope this step, too, will take place over the time to come.
You think they're going to bring back the draft, and why should I sacrifice my 3 grandchildren for this war? Thank you.
Well, the question on The draft is not really one that I can address. That's an issue which I suspect may be addressed in discussions to be held on TV a little later in the course of the evening. But I can speak to the issue of the U.S. and the Middle East. The stakes for the U.S. in Iraq, in the Middle East as a whole, are enormous. The events of September 11th demonstrated, if nothing else in the past 30 years had, that there is an interconnectedness between developments in the Middle East, sometimes subterranean developments, the evolution of jihadist movements, the evolution of religious extremism, that emerge and they strike in the heart of the U.S. We cannot isolate ourselves from the Middle East. We never could. But to the extent we thought that was a possibility, that belief was eradicated the morning of September 11th. The question is not, should we be in the Middle East? We must be present in the Middle East. The issue is how best to structure that presence, what the goals of that presence should be, how best to carry out our broad objectives of democratization, preservation of U.S. fundamental national security and economic interests, and ultimately the evolution of the Middle East into something that looks much more like the rest of the world, like Asia, like Europe, like Latin America, than it has been for so many decades. That's the challenge. There is no simple answer to that. It is not always, certainly, military action, but there are times when military action engagement is necessary, is required. That's a harsh truth, but it is a truth nevertheless.
Where does Afghanistan fit into this vision of the administration for the Middle East?
Afghanistan will be holding presidential elections very shortly, the first presidential elections that country has ever known. While the political situation in the country is not perfect, it is nevertheless more stable, more authentically Afghan in a national sense than it has been at any point in the modern history, or indeed the history of the country. We see Afghanistan as a state moving on the right path politically, towards national unification, towards democratization. It's not there yet, and the elections themselves will not bring it there completely, but they're an important step, and it's something that we've certainly welcomed and will want to continue to build upon.
Yes, in the days ahead, there will be an election in Iran. And assume that it's a free election and an election produces an Islamic government similar to Iran. Will we look at each other and say, what have we done?
We don't believe that Iran and Iraq pose, even in terms of the Shia communities alone, the same situation. Iranian and Iraqi Shias are just that. They're Iranian Shias and they're Iraqi Shias. The Gulf War, I'm speaking of the original Iran-Iraq War, demonstrated to both sides that the supposition that the Shia community that straddled the border was basically more Iranian or more Shia than it was Iranian or Iraqi nationalists. That was completely blown out of the water. Shia fought loyally for their countries, not for their fellow or co-religionists on the other side. Iraqi Shia want the same thing we believe that all Iraqis want. They want a country unified, democratic, where they're able to live their lives in freedom, something they have not known in the history of Iraq, not just Saddam's Iraq, but in the Ottoman and colonial rule that preceded Saddam. We don't see a parallel to the emergence of a clerical regime in Iraq, but we are extremely attentive to Iranian interference and meddling in Iraqi politics. We are extremely attentive to the phenomenon of attempts to encourage or inculcate the kind of radical clerical leadership which Iran possesses, but fundamentally they're two different things, two different peoples.
In Iraq, the United States, the coalition forces are the main military force at this point.
At this point.
And certainly, even after elections, they will be for a while.
For some time.
Now, how do the forces get directed? Would they be directed from the Iraqi government or from our government? There certainly is a potential for conflict there.
On June 28th, the Coalition Provisional Authority, headed by Ambassador Jerry Bremer, went out of existence. And at midnight that night, a U.S. embassy under John Negroponte was established. In the days prior to that transition, a formal undertaking was reached between the Iraqi interim government and the going out coalition authority, the incoming embassy. All forces in Iraq are under the direction of the Iraqi interim government. All forces. However, when exigent circumstances require, those forces have the ability to take decisions on the spot, on the ground, to protect themselves. That's a necessary military step, but they are under the direction and guidance of the Iraqi government. And Secretary Powell, others in the administration have made very clear, when that government tells us collectively the time has come to go, go we will, but that's not been their message. Their message is, we need you. What we want to do, what we are doing under Dave Petraeus' leadership, is to provide the transition, the curve that builds up Iraqi forces that will enable ultimately the non-Iraqi forces in the country to leave. The question was, what is our assessment of the likelihood of the Saudi government reforming itself along the broad lines we have outlined that we wish to see, as opposed to a collapse of the House of Saud and the attendant emergence of perhaps fragmented religious extremist leadership? The Saudis woke up to September 11th, but they didn't wake up on September 11th. It took them about a year before the alarm bell finally got through to them. But it got through, it did. The Saudis woke up to the painful reality that for decades their government had harbored, had fostered, through its subventions, through its tolerance, the evolution in Saudi Arabia and then projected beyond Saudi Arabia into the broader world, not just the Middle East, but Africa, Asia, North America, South America, Europe. Religious extremism, so-called Salafist or jihadist extremist preachers and establishments. The Saudis have been engaged for the better part of the last 2 years in a violent confrontation at home, a confrontation that goes on essentially every day, in which Saudi security forces have died, but many more extremists have died, as the Saudis have at long last confronted at home the viper that they had harbored for so long. But a lot more needs to be done. The Saudis have moved as well on curtailing financing coming from private and non-private sources for groups engaged in terror elsewhere in the Middle East and around the world. That has been a success story of the past 2 years, and a quite dramatic one. But more is necessary. It isn't just confronting religious extremists. It isn't just having moderate religious leaders, much more visible, condemning jihad in the forms that jihad has taken in Iraq, condemning the perversion of Islam, which Zarqawi in Iraq, Osama bin Laden and his followers elsewhere have articulated. They also need to open their system. Municipal elections are going to be held in Saudi Arabia very shortly. They will be the first such elections. But women will not be able to participate, and that remains a very significant problem. A problem for us, but more importantly, a problem for Saudi Arabia, as it seeks to maximize its own potential for the future. What will happen to Saudi Arabia? I don't have a crystal ball. I can only tell you that the regime has begun addressing, very late, but has begun addressing some of the most fundamental issues which had gone unaddressed for far too long. And it must continue to address those broader challenges of openness, of participation, of engaging all of Saudi society. There is no inevitability in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere in the Middle East or the broader Islamic world, no inevitability to the triumph of radical Islam as it's currently being portrayed. That can only happen through inattention and neglect. It can be addressed, it can be dealt with, and a very different kind of society or societies emerge. The question was, what would have happened if a year ago, 2 years ago, different decisions had been taken, and rather than moving in Iraq, the focus had remained upon Afghanistan as the model for the region rather than Iraq as the region? Well, my first comment is an obvious one. We're speaking tonight on September 30th, 2004, and endlessly looking back to what might have been 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago, 6 months ago, quite frankly, has limited value unless the question is, are there lessons there that can be applied today and in the future to the conduct of our interests, the advancement of our interests in the region? That is a very valid question. The obvious point we would make in responding to that question is, had we to do it over again, we would have been much more cognizant of the fragility of the civil infrastructure, the military infrastructure of Saddam's Iraq. We would not have assumed that Saddam had in fact maintained a civil infrastructure of water, oil, electrical supply, of roads. When we entered Iraq, we discovered that that infrastructure had been neglected, not just since '91 and the imposition of sanctions, but for the 30 years of Saddam's rule. We would not have assumed that the military structures in Iraq would have collapsed totally, thoroughly, within weeks of the invasion, leaving a situation of general chaos. And we would have thought through more carefully the extent to which de-Baathification proceeded. Not that de-Baathification is not necessary, just as denazification was necessary in post-1945 Germany. But the manner in which it was conducted and the extent to which it was conducted, all of us acknowledge, could have been done differently.
We would not have entered then if we had known.
No, we would have had a different approach to those issues. The entry into Iraq at the end of the day was to overthrow a brutal dictator, Saddam Hussein. It was based upon the assumption of the world. And whatever the evidence available today may be, and the evidence is, of course, quite overwhelming, the world believed, not just the United States, the world, including the United Nations' own experts, that Saddam both had weapons of mass destruction and was developing further capabilities in that direction. That was, it appears, wrong, but it was a belief all of us held in good faith.
It seems that we are stuck as Americans. On the one hand, the Israelis won't deal with Arafat. On the other hand, Arafat refuses to accept the roadmap requirement to empower his prime minister to control the security forces. Without having these two, we're stuck. So my question is, why doesn't the United States give Israel the blessing to eliminate Arafat, which might then eliminate the logjam and might then move the Arab-Israeli peace process forward from where it's been stuck for the last 4 years?
Because with all of our concern and critique, our critique directed at Chairman Arafat and his manifest failures, we do not believe that physically harming Arafat, touching Arafat by the Israelis, would in any way advance either our U.S. interests in the Middle East or more broadly around the world, or at the end of the day advance Israeli interests. The best solution is not the endless focus upon Yasser Arafat. It is focusing upon empowering alternate leadership. Now that requires two things: Palestinians doing the right things and Israelis doing the right things, and then in turn the international community supporting them. Sadly, that critical mass of right things, of performance on obligations, obligations laid out in the roadmap, obligations made directly to the president in Aqaba and Sharm, those obligations have not been fulfilled. And until they are, it's going to be very difficult to move the broad process forward. But despite that, Gaza disengagement is a watershed event. It compels on all sides a taking of notice. It will require Israel to do things. It will require Palestinians to do things. And it will require the international community to act as well. And we hope out of this can come a positive process that can cut back to the roadmap, back to the two-state vision. But no, we feel extremely strongly no harm to Arafat. It would not be in our interests to see that happen because of the consequences. The question was the post-9/11 evolution in the United States of anti-Muslim, anti-Arab feelings, of the need, how does the administration view this phenomenon, and I think what are we doing to try to address it? Well, it's a very real phenomenon, and it's a very real concern. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, as I think everyone here knows, the administration led by the president was at pains to underscore that this should in no way be seen as a manifestation of either Islam or the Arab world in general, and that in specific acts of intolerance directed at Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, was not something that should be accepted at a local or at a national level, that there was no clash of civilizations, as Sam Huntington continues to argue, exists, some grand confrontation between East and West. We don't think so. We reject that. It's too simple, it's too racist in its delineation of groups. It's simply wrong. But it's a real problem, and it's a problem that requires continued addressal first and foremost at a local level, but also at a national level. It requires addressal overseas as well. Those of you who have followed the news in France realize what a terrible problem the French government and the French people are grappling with in how they accommodate a different kind of Muslim and Arab community in France that does not see themselves in many cases as primarily Frenchmen. What do you do? This is not a model which the French are familiar with. It certainly isn't a model we would be familiar with. We're not alone in grappling with this, but tolerance, understanding, and a clear depiction that the perversion, a word I used before, of Islam, put forward by the Zarqawis and Zawahiris and Osama bin Ladens, is just that. It is a distortion and a manipulation in a bizarre, extremist fringe manner of the basic tenets of Islam. Now, we can call it a distortion. We can call it a perversion. But that has minor weight compared to Islamic clerics in respected institutions in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere, calling it the same thing. And they have. The events of the last 2 weeks, the beheadings, have had a catalytic impact on governments and on Muslim clerics around the world, from Indonesia and Malaysia through to Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Editorials written in religious newspapers have said, what have we become? That this is the face of Islam presented to the world. Who are these people? Where did they come from, and what have we said about them? Now, this is a debate we could never have forced. It's been forced by the horrible actions of these extremists themselves. One can only hope and pray they have gone too far, and that they themselves have sown the seeds in their own religious community of their ultimate isolation and rejection. But we do need, we in the West, we in the United States, to continue to sound that message of tolerance.
I wonder how it is that our powers of persuasion will be so great to make the Iranians cease their nuclear program when, in fact, we've allowed the North Koreans to go forward as much as they have, and even with material we gave them, or the last administration gave them, in any case. And the other point being that the Syrians have harbored several nuclear scientists that have come from Iraq, or from Iraq, and have offered to trade them, from what I've read, to Iran.
Well, that latter point has no basis in anything that we as a government have seen. But your broader point, how do you deal with Iran? How do you persuade them? You attempt to mobilize as much as possible a consensus internationally that is able to spell out, first outline, then impose, if necessary, consequences for Iran. Iran needs exports. Iran needs economic development, financial development. It is responsive when the world takes steps, and it's done so on all too rare occasions, but when the world does take steps that hurt Iranians' rulers where it matters, economically and financially, they do respond. Will it work in the case of the nuclear program? We honestly don't know. There are issues here that are quite complex. Is the nuclear program in Iran a product of this clerical regime and its virulent anti-Western sentiments? Or is it something else? Is it essentially a Persian nationalist program? Are nuclear weapons something which a great state ought to have, because Pakistan and India have them, Israel has them? Iran is a great state, therefore Iran should have them. There are many who would argue this isn't really a transient phenomenon of the clerics. This is an inherently Iranian, Persian development. And you're going to have to get at it by spelling out the consequences, good and bad, for Iran, not just this Iran, but any Iran, from having these weapons in its possession. But that academic argument of what kind of motivations are behind the program pale by the reality that this Iran is governed by a regime of extremists who have shown themselves over and over again to be unresponsive to international pressure on the most damaging and damnable kinds of behavior, from support for terror and violence to subversion to promulgation of violence elsewhere in the region and around the world. And so this regime poses an especial challenge when one looks at acquisition of nuclear weapons. And it's something we have to deal with as best we can.
May I ask another question? Our armed forces, you said, are going to be working for the Iraqi government, such as it is. However, the Marines in Fallujah, the first time they had the city surrounded and were almost finalizing the entire search of the city, were stopped and replaced by a group of Iraqis who eventually joined the terrorists who were already there. Now, is this going to happen again?
That was not a product of the Iraqi government's intervention. That was a conclusion drawn by U.S. commanders with respect to what was effective, manageable, and sustainable, and what was not. Did it work? No. The Fallujah Brigade did not work. There is no control within Fallujah, but don't attribute the withdrawal of the Marine offensive to the Iraqis. This was a U.S. command decision based on a number of very relevant, very real factors.
I find that really unusual for a commander to do. I mean, no.
It's really unusual for the Marines to engage in a land-urban combat. That's really unusual, too.
A follow-up on the Iranian issue. The Iranians feel they are threatened by the presence of the nuclear arsenal that Israel has. And probably that's why they want to build it. Why don't we use the same thing we used with the Libyans to convince the Israelis to disarm, and therefore you solve the whole problem?
Well, I don't think the problem of the Iranian nuclear program can be attributed solely or perhaps even in greatest part to the Israeli nuclear capability. Iran is a state which wishes to project its image as a great state around the world and around the region as a whole. It's not just an Israeli issue. But your question of how do we address the Israeli nuclear issue, answer is as follows. We want to see a nuclear weapons-free Middle East, and that includes Israel. We want to see universal adherence to the NPT, and that includes Israel. But we believe that this event, this goal, can only be achieved after a comprehensive peace is reached in the area, not before.
We've had a marvelous evening. I must say it was well worth waiting for. I think the entire presentation has been cogent, it's been comprehensive, and extraordinarily lucid. And we're deeply in your debt for this. It was
Thank you
wonderful
very much.
evening. Thank you.
Thank you all.